a personal pleasure and honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, the Dr. Alan Hertzke. Dr. Hertzke is a professor of political science and director of religious studies at the University of Oklahoma. A graduate of Colorado State University, Dr. Hertzke earned his master's degree from Cornell University and a PhD degree from the University of Wisconsin. Since receiving his PhD, Dr. Hertzke has taught in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oklahoma, served in the Carl Albert Center there, and now serves also as the Director of Religious Studies at the university. He is the author of several books, including Representing God in Washington, an award-winning analysis of religious lobbies, Echoes and Discontent, an account of church-rooted populist movements, and Religion and Politics in America, a text on the role of religion in American politics. And most recently, he's the author of the book, Freeing God's Children, The Unlikely Alliance for Global Human Rights. In addition to being a scholar, Dr. Hertzke has been a frequent news commentator. He's been featured in such outlets as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, BBC, PBS, and National Public Radio. The topic of his address tonight is the subject of his recently published book, Freeing God's Children, The Unlikely Alliance for Global Human Rights. So would you please join with me in welcoming Dr. Hertzke to Calvin's campus.
Thank you, Corwin, and I really appreciate an introduction by Corwin Smith, who is a major figure in the field of faith and politics in this nation and really a national treasure for his work in this area. And I must say, in all honesty, this is a real honor to be giving a Paul Henry lecture. Many years ago, shortly after I just finished representing God in Washington, I was poking around Washington, D.C., interviewing members of Congress to try to understand the way that religious worldviews might actually shape. Religious worldviews might actually shape their orientation of politics. And I interviewed a variety of members of Congress, and I would always ask the question, well, who else should I interview? And I kept getting this response, well, you have to interview this congressman from Michigan, Paul Henry. And I did interview him, and he was very gracious, generous with his time, deeply thoughtful, a man of tremendous spiritual meaning. And I realized, as I was going through the interview, that this was a remarkable person. And I felt just graced to be in his presence. And so this really is an honor. And I as Corwin and I discussed, when I accepted the generous offer to come here, I didn't realize I was going to be a Paul Henry lecturer. So it's a delightful surprise and a great honor, one that I will treasure always. Beginning in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, a new movement burst onto the international scene. A faith-based movement devoted to promoting human rights through the machinery of American foreign policy. This movement, which operates largely underneath the radar of the elite press, has successfully pressed a series of landmark legislative initiatives, each of which face serious opposition. The first of these, and the catalyst for the rest, is the International Religious Freedom Act, the most sweeping human rights statute on the books, which has transformed religious freedom advocacy around the world. This outcome has stunned both observers both here and abroad. What are the Americans up to? Europeans are asking. Is this serious? Why do they care? Why did Congress pass this law? These are serious questions that continue to be asked about this American initiative in promoting religious freedom through our foreign policy machinery. The outcome was doubly surprising because religious freedom was the stepchild of human rights, largely ignored or slighted by secular human rights groups, and especially the persecution of Christians was something that was not given serious treatment. Now you might ask, why is it that serious religious persecution, the the denial of religious rights might not be attended seriously. Why was it not attended to in the past? Well, to answer that question very briefly, it's because for much of the 20th century, the dominant view of scholars and intellectuals and policymakers and people who went to elite universities was that as societies modernized, they would become less religious. And religion would become less and less important and significant in people's lives. Therefore, you didn't have to study it, pay attention to it, worry about it, or certainly worry about its being curbed. And that vision led to, frankly, insensitivity and blunders. There was actually an incident on the eve of the Iranian Revolution, which has shaken, which is an earth-shaking event, helped to catapult militant Islam into prominence. On the eve of the Iranian Revolution, someone in the CIA actually proposed that it might be a good idea to study what the Iranian clerics were up to. And it was vetoed on the grounds that it was mere sociology and therefore not a serious concern for policymakers, because we know that as societies modernize and Iran is modernizing, religion is less important a factor in people's lives. So religious freedom was in fact slighted. It was the stepchild of human rights. And even into the 1990s, American diplomats were often ignorant of the religious communities in their countries that they supposedly were representing our foreign policy to. There's a famous story that it's not an urban legend, it's a true story, heard it from many sources, but an ambassador appointed by Bill Clinton to China, Jim Sasser, former senator, was given all of the State Department briefings for months about all the issues with respect to U.S.-China relationships. You know, copyright infringement and trade and military technology and so on and so on. So he goes to the congressional hearings and someone says to him, asks him the question, well, what about the house churches in China? What about the persecution of house churches in China? And his response was, what's a house church? Well, that, my friends, has all changed. That has changed through the scaffolding built by this new law, which makes the promotion of religious freedom a basic aim of American foreign policy. You may not know it, but promotion of religious freedom is now embodied by law as a basic aim of American foreign policy. Because diplomats now have to investigate and report on the condition of religious freedom in every country on earth, they now have better contacts with and relationships with religious communities on the ground. And I think it actually might help them avoid some blunders in the future, a side benefit of promoting religious freedom. To give you a sense of how our government is now shining the light on abuses, let me just mention a couple of examples. When the Bush administration was negotiating with the Chinese authorities over Bush's visit to China, the president insisted on his ability to give an address, unedited, to the Chinese people live. And they wanted the president to visit, so they agreed. And what was one of the things the president spoke about? Religious freedom. Our God-given rights to practice, to worship as we see fit. Pretty remarkable. That would not have happened without this new law and the energy behind it. Or another example, just recently Saudi Arabia was listed as a country of concern under the new law, meaning a country that egregiously practices religious persecution or prohibitions in certain ways. Now, this is a strategically important country, and in the past we've been rather tentative about criticizing the Saudis, but indeed that's happened. Well, the success, at least the apparent success, of this effort, this legislative effort, has really galvanized the faith-based community to promote other human rights initiatives. So let me just talk briefly about some of these other initiatives before I get into what's happening here. In 2,000 years, interesting. in 2000, 2 years after the passage of the Religious Freedom Act, Congress passed the Trafficking in Persons Protection Act, which commits U.S. leadership to end the immense modern slave trade. Now, the trafficking of vulnerable women and victimized children into really grotesque forms of sexual exploitation has been with us for a long time. But it metastasized in the 1990s in the freewheeling global environment. Up to 1 million women and children are trafficked every year into bondage, literally, in places where they don't speak the language, don't have papers, or in some cases are literally locked up to serve as customers. Because of the new law passed, because of the energy of the faith-based community, and its tough enforcement of the State Department, countries around the world are actually changing laws and practices. Organized crime, syndicates are being broken up, and emerging norms are taking shape. Women and children literally are being set free. A third initiative, the Sudan Peace Act, was passed in 2002. Every 2 years, a major piece of legislation since '98 is passed. This law plucked the tragedy of Sudan from the backwaters of international concern. Long before the current crisis in Western Sudan and Darfur, and long before 9/11 brought home to us the threat of militant Islam, Christian solidarity activists and their Jewish allies sounded the alarm about the genocidal aim of Khartoum's self-described jihad against its African population, a population made up primarily of traditional African tribal religionists, Christians, and Muslims who do not hew to the militant ideology of Khartoum. In the South, the regime's tactics, which included indiscriminate killings, scorched earth policies, manufactured famine, and mass abductions, left 2 million dead and 5 million displaced over a 20-year period of time. This was Africa's forgotten war before the faith-based movement took it on. It was not being paid attention to. But it was pressure from the faith-based community that led to the passage of the Sudan Peace Act that forced Khartoum to actually cease attacks, come to the peace table, and it set into motion the mass manumission of slaves and thousands of refugees streaming back into their homes in the South. Activists today hope that the same kind of pressure on Khartoum might help to likewise end the tragedy in Darfur. I'll have more to say about that at the end. And finally, the last initiative, the North Korean Human Rights Act, was passed this year. And it focuses attention on the Orwellian regime of Kim Jong-il, whose abysmal human rights record includes a vast system of gulags, wide-scale arrests, torture, killings, and engineered starvation in which the regime literally decides who eats and who doesn't. A German doctor who spent 18 months in North Korea saw children everywhere, children looking like Nazi concentration camp victims, while the party elite enjoyed sumptuous banquets, posh hotels, casinos, and luxury cars. The new law passed by Congress expands protection for North Korean refugees and conditions U.S. humanitarian aid on transparent improvements in access for people in need. And it also mandates inclusion of human rights considerations in all negotiations with the regime. Now, my point here is that any one of these initiatives deserves major note, is a major story. And sometimes the press covered one or the other, but collectively, they represent a striking trend. And they suggest to me, and it's my argument, that the faith-based movement is filling a vacuum, a void in human rights advocacy, addressing issues previously slighted or insufficiently pressed by secular human rights groups, by the prestige press, or the foreign policy establishment. Something special is happening here. Indeed, I would argue, you cannot understand international relations today without understanding this faith-based impact. Yet, this impact remains largely unappreciated in elite circles. And I argue it's in part because evangelicals, almost entirely cast as moralists in the culture wars, provide the crucial grassroots backing for the initiatives just described. This story cannot fit through the lenses of many elite journalists. Now, the distinct role of evangelicals, the born-again community, arises from an historic confluence of events that I describe at length in my book. But my message here tonight is not that we should merely celebrate this new role. Rather, my message is that American religious believers, especially in the evangelical community, bear a heavy responsibility to ensure that this historic opportunity is not squandered. People of faith will determine whether or not this movement is sustained. That's a heavy responsibility. I'd call it a stewardship responsibility. Now, why is it? In other words, what factors have led the evangelical community to the place where they play such a strategic role? What led to this? Well, to begin to answer that question, I thought I would introduce you to some of the people I've gotten to know as a way to give you a flavor for why this movement has gained some energy and zeal and has had a political impact. So let me introduce you to Francis Bach, a striking young man, 6'6.5 feet tall, but with the characteristic slimness of his Dinka tribe. He often leans down to speak, to utter words that in their simplicity seem almost biblical in their cadences. I come here to speak to help free my people from bondage. He's spoken those words at congressional testimonies and before church groups and so forth. Francis Bach, when he was 7 years old, was sent to the market by his mother in a southern village in Sudan. And Arab Murhaleen raiders came through his parents' village and killed all the men, abducted the women and children, burned down the village, killed the animals, the ones they couldn't take. And then they came to the market where Francis was. He saw children killed. He saw the whole village, the whole marketplace burned down. He saw the children with their feet shot off, that sort of thing. And then he was captured. He and the other children and women were captured, ropes tied around their necks, and dragged into bondage. He was, for 10 years, a slave. A literal slave. He was told when he arrived at his master's house, all the children came out with sticks to beat him, yelling "Abid, Abid," meaning slave, slave in Arabic. He was forced to live with the animals because he was told you're an animal. He was given scraps to eat. He worked all day on a wide range herding cattle and sheep, and if he lost one, he was beaten. Tried to escape and was beaten. Finally, after 10 years, he finally escaped, made his way to Cairo, and finally arrived in the United States, one of the lost boys in Sudan. Francis, a devout Christian, is now a spokesman for his people in the United States. Or meet Gatana Metafraya Gatana from Ethiopia. He was arrested for preaching by the communist authorities in the Mengistu regime in the early 1990s. He was tortured, beaten with metal cables, denied food and water for days, had boiling oil poured on his feet. He ultimately escaped. Then the regime collapsed and he went back to his home region, only to be threatened with arrest because a militant Islamic court in his home region had threatened him with arrest for evangelizing. So he fled, this time to the United States, a radiant man who belies the torture he endured and is now an evangelist who also speaks on religious freedom issues around the country. Or a pastor known affectionately as Pastor Wally, Filipino. He pastored secretly to his flock in Saudi Arabia. where professing Christianity or worshiping is against the law. And you have many Filipino workers in Saudi Arabia, and worshiping is, or leading a worship can be a death sentence. He was arrested, he was threatened with execution, and only the intervention by American and other European authorities kept him from being arrested. He was evicted and is now a major speaker in the evangelical circle. And once again, a person of good humor, radiant, belies what he went through. Well, there's a man named Noble Alexander who spent years in Cuban jails and organized a surreptitious evangelizing network, copying passages from the Bible on scraps of paper and secreting them through the prison walls. Whenever he was found out that he was evangelizing, of course, he was beaten and so forth. And one time he was placed waist deep in a pool of sewage overnight. And he describes in vivid terms in the evangelical argot of his kind that a beautiful blossom came out at night and overcame the stench, which was a sign to him that he was in God's grace. And then there's Lee Soon-ok from North Korea. She was a communist official, low-level communist official in her government, until a minor infraction sent her into the gulags of that regime. And she noticed that special punishment was meted out to Christians. Anyone who recognized an authority higher than the state was a threat to the regime, because after all, Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung are treated as gods under the ideology of that regime. And so she noted how they would be killed before their relatives, but they would continue to sing hymns. She noted how they would be told, if you would just renounce your God, we will set you free, and they didn't. Do we think that there are only martyrs in the past? Well, finally, a personal note. I met a young woman when I was lecturing in China. I call her Saint Joan of Xi'an. I often spoke before college students there, and she was just graduating from one of the top universities in China. Polished, sophisticated, intelligent, flawless English, attractive young woman. And she was a political science major, so I took right to her, of course. And she described to me how I was lecturing on religion and politics in America, of all things, in China. Chinese are interested in why we care about what's going on there. And so she came up quietly afterwards and she said, well, I belong to a fellowship, which is a code word for I'm a house church Christian. I worship under the government radar. I don't belong to an official state church. And she said, you know, I could get any kind of government job I want. I have a great career. But if I want a job in the Chinese administration, I have to profess atheism. I have to join the Communist Party and profess atheism. Now, there's a lot more freedom in China than there used to be, but that's still a real reality. And she said, you know, I can't do that. And I was sort of stunned, in a way, by that young woman's conviction, her courage, the peacefulness with which she made that declaration. Many of you have heard the saying, if you were charged with being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict? I think about that a lot for myself. Well, these people have been convicted, literally, of being Christians. Is it any wonder they're an inspiration to American religious congregations, to people in the policy-making machinery in Washington and so forth? They have experienced the high cost of discipleship, and they have remained true. And they represent the increasingly dominant face of global Christianity. And that's my point. Because of a demographic revolution that has occurred in this world, the vast majority of believers, Christians, live in the developing world. In 1900, fascinating statistic, in 1900 only 20% of the world's Christian population lived outside of North America and Greater Europe. Today that figure is 60% and growing. Thus, American churches are increasingly mere branches of wider global ministries. That's obvious of the Catholic Church to which I belong, but it's also true of the evangelical world, where perhaps even 3/4 of all believers or adherents now live in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So the significance of my stories about these martyrs not yet, let's hope, but heroes, disciples, is that they represent increasingly the face of global Christianity, not the comfortable Christianity of the West. Now, what accounts for this demographic revolution that is so important to this new faith-based movement? Why is Christianity now the majority faith in sub-Saharan Africa? The majority faith in sub-Saharan Africa. Why, despite persecution, is Christianity growing so rapidly in China? Why has it come to anchor the civilization and culture in South Sudan? One explanation often offered is theological, that the Christian message of love and redemption and transcendent reward is especially appealing to the poor and vulnerable of this earth. Always has been, always will. That's why, as one scholar of missions put it, Christianity is always withering at the center and expanding at the periphery. And the center, therefore, will always shift. Another explanation is actually rooted in social science. The powerful forces of modern communication, capitalism, technology, and economic globalization uproot people and weaken ancestral ties to traditional faiths, especially faiths rooted in place. That produces a spiritual vacuum that the great proselytizing or missionary faiths, such as Christianity and Islam, rush in to fill. Whatever the explanation, the one result of this growth is that believers threaten despotic governments. Christian believers threaten despotic governments who are fearful of independent civil society. Because Christians pay allegiance to an authority higher than the state, they are not easily bribed or intimidated. And they also become victims of widespread persecution or mob violence by dominant religious groups. So there's a reason why this growing proportion of Christians in the developing world are victims of persecution and harassment, because they threaten despotic governments and dominant religious groups. Some estimates suggest that at least 250 million Christians live under these conditions around the world. Live under conditions of the great threat of persecution, harassment, arrest, mob violence, confiscation of property, torture, destruction of church buildings, and so forth. Just to give you a flavor for how governments sometimes view this population, I'll give you an example from China. The Chinese authorities watched in horror as Christian churches in Eastern Europe helped to undermine the regimes, the communist regimes there. And in 1992, a House organ, a newspaper of the Communist Party, wrote the following: "If we are to avoid this spectacle in our own country, we must strangle the baby while it is still in the manger." The Chinese actually knew their Bible story well. They knew which figure in the Bible they actually were identifying with. We must strangle the baby while it is still in the manger. And of course, if you look at the militant Islamic movement, we hear so much about the war on terror and how there were underpinnings to it, it was building and so forth and so on. But what we do know now, I think pretty clearly, is that bin Laden's declaration against the West, as he overtly said, was a declaration against Christianity and Judaism. He declared a war on Jews and, quote, crusaders, meaning Christians. Throughout the Islamic world, militant groups attack Christian minorities. They, in fact, were often early victims of militant Islamic movements. They were, in that sense, as one activist put it, the canaries in the coal mine. You know how this works? You bring a canary in a coal mine. If the canary dies, the the air isn't very good, get out of there. Well, often Christian minorities in some of these Islamic lands were early victims of these militant movements. And they were warning signs that something was brewing. In fact, Bishop Ghaziz, the Catholic bishop of southern Sudan, whose archdiocese is larger than the country of Italy, came to the United States in 1999 and gave a speech in Washington in which he said, "The jihad that has been unleashed by these militants against my people will come home to the United States." And everybody thought he was kind of exaggerating, nuts, inflammatory, and so forth. Or look at India, a democratic country, certainly. But mob violence incited by militant Hindu nationalists has resulted in deaths of both Muslims and Christians, minorities in that country. The point here is that there are many Christian martyrs dying for their faith today. In fact, some estimate that there were more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than all the other centuries combined. Now you can say, well, it's because population was greater. There also were a lot of Christians who weren't persecuted. But I think it's probably accurate. Christians who were killed for their faith, there were probably more in the 20th century than all the other centuries combined. Martyrdom is not a thing of the past. So, the Christian church, the increasingly global Christian church, is a suffering church in many places. But it no longer suffers in silence because global communications and travel and global development and networks increasingly bring that suffering church into the congregations and parishes and lives and consciousness of American believers. And I suspect some of you have seen this happen. And because the Christian church abroad is also nested amidst poverty and exploitation and war and violence and exploitation, at least a cadre, some American believers, are awakening more generally to the afflictions visited on the world's vulnerable. So we have the picture, at least, of a new concern among American believers for human rights. A second development enables evangelicals uniquely to act politically on these concerns. Animated by distress over the drift of American culture, evangelicals have built, as I say here, a booming network of alternative schools, colleges, national associations, publishing houses, direct mail groups, parachurch organizations, and broadcast ministries. Think about it. As Robert Putnam observed in his famous book, Bowling Alone, American evangelicals have created the largest, best organized grassroots social networks of the last quarter century. Now think about that for a minute. There is a growing concern for persecution of fellow believers and other human rights, and there is these social networks. These two developments were moving along in parallel fashion like tributaries of a river until they finally connected or joined. And as they connect, the social networks of the evangelical world, which were born of conservative impulses, are increasingly being put to use in justice and human rights concerns that are normally associated with progressive politics. A striking development indeed. This striking development has been largely overlooked, as I mentioned, by the press in its obsession with the moral values debate. And this development facilitates wonderfully unusual alliances. My favorite topic in my Congress class is Strength Bedfellows alliances, I like to talk about. During successive campaigns over the last 7 years, I have literally watched as conservative evangelical leaders, people you will recognize, Charles Colson, Prison Fellowship, Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention, Richard Cizik of the National Association of Evangelicals, and others, worked hand in hand with liberal Jews, liberal Episcopalians, Tibetan Buddhists, Iranian Baha'is, even feminists on the sex trafficking issue. That took some work. What began, therefore, as a Christian solidarity quest, or Christian solidarity movement blossomed into a broader quest for human rights. And this has infused a lot of new life into a cause often trumped by narrow economic and strategic calculations, which are often very powerful. But my argument and my concern is that without sustained effort, these powerful and economic forces will yet again overwhelm human rights and humanitarian concerns as they often have in the past. Thus, I'd like to return to my message. A confluence of circumstances, human rights zeal born of a Christian solidarity impulse, the rise of these new social movement networks that knit people together, and, I might add, a special access to the Bush administration that we've all read about, has given the evangelical community the capacity to sustain the cause of human dignity around the world. With that capacity, I believe, comes a duty to act and act effectively. But what does that take? Well, let me offer a few imperatives for religious political actors. I've spent the last 2 decades of my life studying faith and politics, religion and politics, understanding how this works. These are just a few imperatives that I think are important for religious political actors to understand. First, to be effective, you must develop a deep theological grounding for your work and make it integral to Christian formation. This is something that Congressman Paul Henry embodied, and something that I am delighted to say that Calvin College is devoted to making happen. Unfortunately, as Mark Knoll and others have pointed out, the evangelical impulse in many cases is not conducive to deep theological reflection on how to work out the gospel in politics. There is, as Mark Knoll notes, a kind of immediatism, an emphasis on the immediate moment and the spirit, which is wonderful for building a sense of community and contact with the divine, but does not solve the problem of how you go about making the political system work for you. You need to have a clear vocabulary of justice, an understanding of why you must act in the world on behalf of the poor and the dispossessed. You must not see the world in such Manichaean dualistic terms that you can't work with people you oppose on other issues in the interest of a higher end. You have to understand that as stewards of wealth and influence, you can make a difference if you act with reflection and thought. And a couple of politicians that I've come to admire, I really think can, in a way, embody that and echo the kind of work that Paul Henry did. Frank Wolf is a member of Congress from Virginia, very much admired across both sides of the aisle. Nancy Pelosi, liberal Democrat from San Francisco, once referred to Frank Wolf as, quote, my leader on the religious freedom issue. Another strange bedfellow alliance that I enjoy watching. But Frank Wolf has gone into prisons. In fact, he's not only gone into prisons to visit religious prisoners, he's actually gone into places incommunicado without people knowing he was a congressman, so he could find out what conditions were really like. He was one of the first people into Tibet to visit, to see what was happening with the crackdown on the Buddhists there, went into the Soviet Union and so forth. Frank Wolf told me something very pointed. He said, if you have a position of influence and you don't use it, then that is a violation of your divine mandate. I mean, you are not living out your gospel mandate. He said, if I don't use what I have, why am I doing this job? It's not just to get rid of it. Another congressman, Chris Smith of New Jersey, is Catholic, also a good friend of Frank Wolf's, dedicated human rights activist, said to me that he sees himself as a Matthew 25 Christian. And everything he does, he tries to think through in terms of Matthew 25, what you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do to me. Whether it's inoculations for children in Central America, or whether it's AIDS funding in Africa, or whether it's debt relief, or whether it's human rights for persecuted Christians or Buddhists or Baha'i believers or Sufi Muslims in Western Darfur. He sees his role as acting on that biblical mandate. That, to me, is a reflection of a sense of theological grounding that helps you orient yourself to politics. And that's number one. Number two, to be effective, to use this new stewardship responsibility. To be effective, you have to be tough. This is my tough part of the lecture. You have to be tough. Politics is, and power is, seductive. Religious leaders are sometimes seduced by blandishments, by invitations to the White House, by invitations to serve on advisory committee posts. Well, that's not enough. If you're fighting for international justice, that's just not enough. It won't wash. You must make tough demands on the system, tougher demands on the system than that. Know your power. One of the striking things I noticed in the movement is how much Jewish leaders prodded their evangelical friends to act more aggressively. And that's I suppose, because Jews understand that in order to be effective, you have to have chutzpah. And of course, you know what chutzpah is. It's that sort of audacious daring, the sense that you demand access because you deserve it. And the joke, the Yiddish joke, is that chutzpah is when a boy kills his parents and then pleads to the court for mercy on account that he's an orphan. That's chutzpah. Well, you know, there's a story that David Saperstein, a religious leader, and told me, is that, you have to act like you deserve access. You have to act like you should talk with a senator, not some staffer. You have to be tough. And I think, in a way, as I thought about tough, it occurred to me that perhaps the best way to capture this is the parable Jesus taught of the widow and the judge, the widow and the judge. How the widow needed justice. She had been injured. She demanded justice. Her cause was right. The judge kept ignoring her, dismissing her. But the widow keeps coming back again and again and again and asking for what? Justice. Give me justice, the widow says. Perhaps we could think about that parable in another way. Perhaps God is the woman saying of us, or demanding of us, give me justice. So if you're in the business of fighting on behalf of justice and human dignity and human rights, then you can't give up because it gets tough. Or you can't give up because you have setbacks. You've got to be tough. Now that's not the same thing as being foolhardy. So my third rule of how to be effective is you've got to think strategically. You have to use your mind. And this is something that Mark Noll believes sometimes evangelicals are less likely to do. Passionate, desiring immediate results, not willing to think in grubby terms about what's the best timing for this, what are the opportunities, who should I have as allies, when might this happen, when might not it happen. In order to be effective, you actually have to think in those terms. So that's why we have these brilliant professors at Calvin College that teach policy analysis and political science, so that people can bring their faith into the practical, grubby world of politics and make things happen. You need sophisticated political analysis. And sometimes that's lacking. Now, to be effective, you also have to work in coalition. And that's, in fact, a feature that's almost imperative in our political system. It's rare. It takes major presidential pressure and a majority in Congress for something to slide through with a bare majority. Most of the time, most policy requires supermajorities and sustained pressure to keep them going, which means you need to have broad coalitions to be successful, which means you have to form coalitions with people you might feel uncomfortable with. But what I noticed and I found so fascinating in this new faith-based movement was that, in fact, a number of evangelical leaders were working closely with liberal Jews, with Catholics, and Anglican, Episcopalians, and Buddhists, and even Sufi Muslims who are aggrieved, and realizing that they could build relationships of trust on these issues. And what was fascinating is that they could acknowledge their differences on other issues. I had, in fact, one Jewish lobbyist told me, she said, you know, in the morning I go to meetings and we're working with the conservative religious community on human rights around the world, and in the afternoon I'm fighting them over abortion and gay rights. But that's the way our system works. And there still is tension out there in the evangelical community about whether you should work with people you fundamentally disagree with on other issues or not. And one evangelical leader told me, sort of, I think in a moment of lapse, when the person said, you know, Rabbi Saperstein makes me uneasy because he fights us on everything else. He opposes everything else we believe in, and yet, you know, he's part of our coalition. And that person was not comfortable allowing this liberal Jewish leader, who in fact does fight the Christian right on a lot of things, to be a part of a coalition when in fact he was a fundamental and vital presence, bringing liberal Democrats on board, helping to provide ecumenical legitimacy for the movement and so forth. So the question is, will this sectarian impulse overwhelm the more ecumenical impulse? Or, the question may be put this way, to advance international human rights, or humanitarian intervention, or human dignity abroad, or at home for that matter, are you willing to partner with those on opposite sides of the culture wars, or not? I think that's an important question. Finally, to be effective, you must be in for the long haul. Recall, if you will, the life of William Wilberforce, who is often referred to and adverted to by leaders in this new faith-based movement, Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, and so forth. William Wilberforce was a British parliamentarian of the late 18th century who in 1787, in a speech in Parliament, devout Christian, said, I set before me two objects, the end of slavery and the reformation of manners and morals. And for the next 4 decades plus, he worked to end the slave trade and the existence of slavery in the British Empire. That's the long haul. He worked tirelessly for 2 decades to get a law passed in Parliament that abolished the slave trade. He worked for more than 2 decades after that to get slavery abolished throughout the British Empire. And what that did, by the way, is it made the British Navy an instrument of liberation and provided a moral legitimacy to the British Empire that actually catapulted it into the great Victorian era. And it also led to a great reformation of morals, because the slave trade was in fact degrading to the moral fiber of the British in a whole host of ways. Well, you have to have a long-term focus to be successful and effective in American politics, or any kind of politics. One White House official told me, he said, you know, policy around here is like Groundhog Day. You know the movie with Bill Murray? You've seen this movie. He has to repeat every day over and over until he kind of gets it right. Well, that's what policy is like. You have to fight the same battles over and over. It's like you win one time and then you go, wait a minute, the bureaucracy's mushing it, we got to fight that battle over again. A great example occurred in the sex trafficking issue that I mentioned. There was an enormous amount of effort and lobbying, and months of negotiation, and finally Congress passes the Trafficking in Persons Act in 2000. And everybody celebrates, and there's this solemn occasion where people are reflecting on how this is going to change history, and victimized women are there, and members of Congress, and activists, and so forth. Well, a year later, the thing was bogged down in the State Department. Wasn't being implemented hardly at all. The reports were mushy, wasn't effective. The person directing it was a low-level person in the State Department with not much cachet or clout. And the activists were despairing. So basically, they fought a deep bureaucratic battle. They put pressure on the Bush administration to remove the person and place somebody with real stature in that position. That was a long, hard battle. And it worked. But it took enormous effort. Or take the Sudan reality for a minute as an example of the need for a long-term focus. On the eve of the peace treaty in the South, which was sealed because of the Sudan Peace Act, the regime unleashed, of course, its attacks on the West against the Africans of Darfur. These are Muslim Sufis primarily. And that attack produced a humanitarian nightmare, a slow-motion genocide. Now, while the Bush administration has acted to get relief supplies to those in need and has issued the first ever genocide declaration since the International Convention was signed, the situation is dire and more vigorous action will be required to forestall further mass death. Yet, unfortunately, so far, I do not see the same degree of mobilization in the religious community on Darfur that I saw in the campaign to end the war in southern Sudan. To date, the religious response has been fragmented, even anemic compared to the crisis. I pray that this diminished evangelical action is not due to the fact that Muslims are being slaughtered and not Christians. I fear that the presidential election and the battle over gay marriage have siphoned off energies. But I can hope that a new engagement will prevent Darfur from becoming another case of international neglect like Rwanda. The point is that international pressure can make a difference. U.S. leadership can make a difference. Evangelical leadership can make a difference on Darfur. That's the kind of responsibility that I'm talking about. To illustrate my point about the special responsibility of the evangelical world and about how hard politics is and how much you have to work at it to make things happen, I'd like to conclude with the story of one person to show you just what it took to free one child of God, Lana, a six-year-old Cambodian girl who was being sold for sex in a notorious brothel, a village, actually, a notorious village outside of Phnom Penh, controlled exclusively by traffickers and pimps with bribed police. You would think that such an egregious outrage, such a violation of fundamental dignity and justice, such a gut-wrenching situation, once it's brought to light, surely the solution would be solved. Surely. But let me tell you what it took to free Lana, one child of God. First of all, it took the efforts of a man named Gary Haugen. Gary Haugen was the chief UN investigator for the Rwanda War Crimes Tribunal. He went into Rwanda and looked at mass graves and interviewed people who had been victims or saw victims slaughtered to try to provide the documentary record for the genocide that occurred in Rwanda. This was such a gut-wrenching experience. It so shook him to the marrow of his bones that he decided he had to do something. A devout evangelical Christian, he said, I must do something for international justice, for those who are victims of outbreaks like this. And so he formed and helps to fund the International Justice Mission. And the organization is devoted to hiring lawyers and investigators around the world to take on cases where people's fundamental rights are being violated, widows are being denied land or inheritance, children are being sold into virtual slavery and sweatshops and so forth. And particularly the issue of trafficking of vulnerable women and children was high on his list of concerns. Well, he and his investigators had heard about this village called Pak in Cambodia. This village that was controlled by traffickers and by pimps. And remarkably enough, believe it or not, years earlier, there was actually a delegation of United Nations AIDS employees working on AIDS prevention who went into this village, and their response was not to try to free the girls and women, it was to teach them safe sex. Astonishing enough. Well, what did Haugen do? He sent in an undercover investigator posing as a sex tourist. The person had a hidden camera and videotaped Lana being sold to another customer for sex. Gary Haugen took this tape, showed it to the Cambodian authorities. You'd think something would happen, nothing happened. He showed it to members of Congress, to the media, to State Department officials. They started to pay attention. But still nothing happened. Meanwhile, parallel developments are taking place in Washington. Activists, religious activists, are working together for months, putting together the Trafficking in Persons Act. And what did it take to get that bill passed? It took not only months of negotiations, but a kind of long minuet between religious leaders, evangelical leaders, and feminist groups about whether they could really work together or not. It was like a minuet. When they finally agreed they could work together to promote the cause of dignity for women and children who were victimized in this way, that provided some clout, and Congress passed this law. But that didn't provide enough leverage to free Lana yet. We have Gary Haugen in his film. We have the new law passed, and yet that's not enough yet. What else did it take? It took an internal struggle in the bureaucracy to get a new person appointed as director of the Trafficking in Persons Office. And let me tell you the story about this. It's fascinating. After the Bush administration eased out the person who was directing that office ineffectually, the officials sought for somebody else. And Frank Wolf, congressman from Virginia, and an activist, Mike Horowitz, who helped to prod the evangelical leaders to action, got together, and they were asking themselves who would be a good person. And the name of John Miller from Seattle was brought up. And Frank Wolf said, I worked with him in Congress. The guy must either be a saint or a fool because he opposed Boeing on human rights in China. In other words, he opposed the largest lobby and the largest employer in his district because he believed that human rights was more important than economics. So they called John Miller, and he was teaching at a yeshiva school, teaching high school to Jewish students. He came to Washington. He was taught about the issue, and he said, this is my issue. And when he was announced as the new director of the Trafficking in Persons Office at the State Department and gave a speech, he said in his speech, my job, as was Wilberforce's, is to end modern-day slavery. That's now the official position of the United States government as articulated by John Miller. And he's there because religious activists demanded that someone with spine and vision be in that office. Well, what did he do? He enforced the law. The law said that if a country was not cracking down on its trafficking industry, was allowing organized crime to victimize women and kids this way, that the United States government would designate them as a Tier 3 country, and that country would lose real benefits. All John Miller had to do when he got information from Gary Haugen and the International Justice Mission, and when he saw the film, was communicate to the Cambodian authorities, you will be listed on Tier 3, and you will lose American benefits, favorable trade and so forth, unless you crack down on this industry. Finally, the Cambodian authorities decided to act in concert with investigators of Gary Haugen's. They went into State Pack, full force, arrested the traffickers and pimps, freed at that moment some 40, mostly girls, including Lana herself, who was still there. In place of the grainy videotape, that horrific videotape of Lana being sold for sex, the 6-year-old girl, there's now a photograph that the International Justice Mission has of this young girl smiling, soft drink in hand, laughing with friends. My friends, it took a lot. It took a lot. But because of the faith-based movement, Lana, a child of God, was set free. Thank you.
Why don't we devote maybe about 10, 15 minutes to questions. And as I said, there is a reception outside. I'm sure Ellen would be happy to talk with you in the reception area as well, but let's spend some time here just with
And I'll be happy to sign a book. This is a new thing for me, so it's thrilling. You know, most scholars, when you publish a book, you don't do signing. So and I know some of you need to leave. So what questions do you have? I had to race through some things, but I'm sure this raises some questions. I'm happy to answer. Yes?
When we talk about human rights and human dignity and justice, either the Reformed social thought tradition and the Catholic tradition of social thought, that includes economic rights and a variety of them. You talked about the need for the evangelicals to move forward and continue to expand. Do you see any evidence that in their thinking economic rights are an important part of human rights and dignity?
Right. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I think I'll just stay out here for a little bit. That microphone barking at. I think the best evidence that there is a nascent understanding or an emerging understanding that economics is an important part, of an ability to live out one's life, deals with the debt issue, the third world debt. In the year 2000, there was a Year of Jubilee campaign based upon the idea in the Old Testament that there should be a time of Jubilee in which debts are forgiven. And the Pope was a prominent figure in that. Bono, the rock star, the Pope wore his sunglasses, and they got together for a photo op together. And the churches in America were very involved. And what was interesting is that a number of evangelical organizations, faith, international aid and development organizations, were very strongly on board in that campaign. World Vision and other evangelical organizations were there because they were in the country, seeing how the debt piled on that country by previous dictators was burdening people. So that, for example, in Uganda, when the debt was forgiven, they were able to hire several thousand nurses. They couldn't hire them, and other teachers and so on. Well, people on the ground saw that and were communicating. And the same networks I was talking about, these global church networks, were translating that information to their counterparts in the United States. The Christian community is a global community. A third of the world's population is Christian at some level. And the Christian churches are global communities. They're global organizations. And so that, I think, is an indication that's happening. I don't know how deep it reaches at the grassroots level here. I'm not sure even how deep the human rights concern reaches. It's among the cadres there, but I'm not sure how far. But I would hope it would. Yes?
You mentioned about being in it for the long haul, and I know that you mentioned congressmen, particularly this Frank Wolf involved in prison reform or whatever. What about the term limits and the impact then for something long term? In Michigan here, the new Speaker of the House, he's been in the legislature 2 years. Mental Health Commission that just had a report, that's the first one in 25 years. Previously, a couple decades ago, I could name 3 or 4 legislators that stood for particular causes, and their names were associated with various social justice issues. This Mental Health Commission right now is just a reaction to the previous administration. Talk about that a little bit.
We obviously don't have that problem at the national level. Members of Congress are not term limited. And I think that would be unfortunate. I think it'd be better if we had more competitive elections. They're not, because they all have safe seats. But they're not term limited in Washington, and we would lose some really remarkable leaders. But I guess what I'm saying is this is also important for those who wish to influence policymakers, not just policymakers themselves. In other words, if you have a cause you're concerned about, and you become a part of an organization or a church group, you can't give up after the first setback. Or you can't even give up after your first success. That's the other thing. Neither. You can't give up. But I do concur with your concern. Lose some. Yes.
You know, I'm just reviewing this list here, and in the context of your saying about how global Christianity is, and then looking at the list of theological grounding, toughness, strategic thinking, working coalitions, and so on, all of those things sounded to me like they were kind of oriented towards people here in the United States who kind of know what's going on and what the world needs. And I guess I'm wondering, as a person who does a lot of third world sort of stuff, where the respect for the other part of the global Christianity and maybe even beyond that, where the listening is, where and I ask that especially because I'm concerned about the tone of the current administration, which is kind of a we know the story and everybody move aside because we know what to do.
Well, the question is, I think, a very good one, and it makes me think. I saw a lot of examples of listening because so many of the foreign Christian leaders had such compelling stories and information and just strength. And I think a lot of people who were listening were awed by them. And so in that sense, what I saw, and what actually awed me and made me feel like I have to be the steward of this story. I mean, it's sort of like, I didn't do it for ego. I think it was like, oh my gosh, I'm witnessing this. I better get it on paper and get it out there. But I actually saw how vulnerable people abroad were being brought into councils, policy councils in the United States, and were being listened to. Commissions were holding hearings in which a variety of representatives of vulnerable communities around the world were testifying and were listening intently. And in fact, I think that's one of the geniuses of the International Religious Freedom Act. They created this independent commission, 9-member commission, appointed by both Congress and the President, bipartisan, ecumenical. It's got a wide array of people on it. And they have their own budget and staff and a mandate to investigate violations of religious freedom and report on them and to advocate policy changes. And they travel around the world and they do a lot of listening. And I think in some ways, you're making me think that we need more of that kind of thing.
I'm just wondering if it should be a 6-point.
Maybe, I think you're right. Make it number 6. Listen. And in some ways, maybe that's a part of, analysis. is you have to understand what the situation is. You can, I mean, and I think it's a good point. We can barge into a situation and make things worse real easily. And during the debate over the International Religious Freedom Act, there was a very rich and healthy debate. Will there be unintended consequences? What if we put local religious communities at more peril by raising these issues? Shouldn't we listen to them first before we craft this legislation? And they did listen, and they did change the legislation to accommodate those kinds of concerns. But I think it's a great point, and next time I give this lecture, you'll be there. I'll put it in there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the human right of listening to other nations' view of human rights. I'm glad you've been to China, so my question comes out of the background of teaching 3.5 times the past 5 years at Peking University. The China Daily, every year that the Human Rights Report comes out, is very, very angry. And what gets published, as you probably know, is 2 full pages of American human rights abuses, very, very small print. And I think part of the problem is that on the American side, they don't understand that what's important in Chinese culture is not, first of all, individual freedom. I mean, that is emergent slowly, but is harmony, civility, security. And people have struggled hard to achieve life. They don't easily go on to life, to liberty, and pursue happiness. I mean, our students tell us that all the time. What angers them is that there's no appreciation of the cultural background, and the fact that political and religious rights will probably come last in Chinese culture, whereas they were the seedbed from which all other rights came in America. And what angers them especially is that there's practically no word of recognition of what has been achieved in human rights in education, in society, sexual equality, in education opportunities, in job market opportunities, in infrastructure. You can go on and on how life is so much better, how rights have been recognized in all fields except, well, increasingly, but religious and political will tend to come last. And the focus of the Human Rights Report is almost exclusively on religion and politics, with no recognition of the other things that have been achieved. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, should there be more sensitivity for the human rights within the Human Rights Reports? I've talked to other people from other national experiences. They say the State Department reports in other nations are also very much that same sort of thing.
Well, it's a very important question. I'm not sure I have a fully satisfactory answer. It would require a long discussion, because there's a huge discussion, debate about the nature of human rights. Are they fundamental? Are they universal? And the question of whether different cultures have different visions and so forth. And I think that greater sensitivity to cultures is always important. That's always valuable. I fall down a little bit more on the side of the view that for the people for whom rights are being denied, arrested, held in confinement, tortured, when the word gets down to them that somebody cares, that's important. And Frank Wolf has told me, and I've actually been told by others who know Frank Wolf, that when you travel through Eastern Europe, just after the fall of communism, that people would carry around letters that Frank Wolf wrote on behalf of a pastor. That pastor would carry it around as a talisman to prevent them from being arrested again. And they knew in the prison, Andrei Sakharov has said that they knew in the prison when Westerners were visiting and criticizing the human rights record of the Soviet Union. China has perhaps the largest population of Christian prisoners for faith in the world. Now, for those people, when the human rights report and the religious freedom reports come out, the word may circulate down. And for people who are themselves, huddling in the forest, trying to worship together for fear of the authorities, I think they appreciate the report. And I was told by an ambassador, a senior official, in fact, former head of the Secretary General of the Foreign Service, that while the governments don't like them, they all buy the human rights report and read them carefully, and in many cases try to respond as best they can. Not just repudiating them, but trying to, in some ways, deal with them.
Okay, please join with me in thanking Alan for his... As I indicated, there are refreshments over in the lobby of the Prince Conference Center. Please join us there. We have plenty of refreshments, and Alan will be signing books, and you can talk with him there as well.
You have to find it.